In the early months of 1921, a brilliant American inventor made a seemingly minor chemical discovery that would alter human destiny. He didn't invent a deadlier weapon, a totalitarian ideology, or a new drug, yet his creation would cause millions of violent crimes. Decades later, cities across the entire globe would burn, murder rates would skyrocket, and elite criminologists would be left completely baffled. For generations, experts blamed changing morals, broken homes, and economic collapse for this terrifying, sudden wave of human brutality. But the real culprit wasn't a flaw in human nature or culture, it was an invisible, microscopic neurotoxin floating in the air. This is the dark, mind-bending story of how a simple additive in everyday automobile fuel hijacked the human brain on a massive scale. It remains the ultimate testament to the ripple effect, where one man's industrial solution triggered a multi-decade psychological catastrophe. To fully comprehend this toxic butterfly effect, we must journey back to an era of unbridled industrial optimism and rapid engineering marvels. In the Roaring Twenties, the automotive industry was exploding, but early internal combustion engines suffered from a violent, destructive defect. Whenever these primitive cars tried to accelerate up a hill, the fuel would ignite prematurely, causing a metallic rattling known as knocking. This relentless knocking didn't just sound terrible, the violent shockwaves inside the cylinders would literally tear the heavy iron machinery apart. General Motors desperately needed a savior, so they handed the high-stakes problem to an eccentric mechanical engineer named Thomas Midgley Jr. Midgley was a man driven by relentless curiosity, and he began systematically testing thousands of different chemical compounds on the periodic table. In December of 1921, he discovered that adding a compound called tetraethyl lead to gasoline eliminated engine knocking instantly. It was cheap to manufacture, highly effective, and immediately hailed as a miraculous breakthrough that would power the global transport revolution. There was only one massive, undeniable problem that corporate executives chose to ignore: lead was a known, lethal neurotoxin. Since the days of the ancient Roman Empire, physicians knew that lead poisoning caused severe madness, physical decay, and death. Within months of opening the manufacturing plants, factory workers began suffering from vivid, terrifying hallucinations, slipping into violent insanity. Several workers tragically lost their lives, and Midgley himself was forced to take a lengthy leave of absence to cure his own poisoning. Yet, driven by the promise of immense, multi-billion-dollar profits, the oil cartels hid the danger, marketing the fuel under the safe name ethyl. This leads us directly into the first major escalation, the silent, invisible invasion of the collective human nervous system. As millions of newly fueled automobiles flooded into cities worldwide, they began spewing tons of microscopic lead particles into the open air. This heavy toxic dust didn't just drift away, it settled directly onto city streets, school playgrounds, and into the lungs of children. Once inhaled or ingested from dirty hands, lead enters the human bloodstream and performs a terrifying trick of biological mimicry. The human body mistakes the toxic lead for essential minerals like calcium, allowing it to easily slip past the highly protective blood-brain barrier. For a young, rapidly developing child, this chemical intrusion acts as a devastating sledgehammer to long-term neurological health. Lead actively disrupts the delicate formation of neural pathways, specifically focusing its destruction on a region known as the prefrontal cortex. Modern neuroscience tells us that the prefrontal cortex is the absolute seat of human self-control, empathy, and executive function. It acts as the brain's emotional braking system, allowing individuals to calculate consequences, regulate intense anger, and resist violent impulses. When lead poisons this vital region during childhood, it permanently blunts the brain's ability to control sudden, aggressive emotional outbursts. An entire generation of children, particularly in crowded urban environments, was raised breathing a chemical mist that structurally altered their biology for violence. They were not born naturally malicious, their biological capacity for moral restraint was systematically erased by the air they breathed. As we transition into the second act of escalation, we watch this hidden neurological damage erupt into an unprecedented global crisis. When you expose millions of toddlers to a powerful brain toxin, the societal consequences do not appear overnight. You have to wait exactly 20 years, until those specific toddlers grow up into young adults entering their prime crime-committing age. And right on cue, beginning in the late 1960s, something deeply terrifying and inexplicable began happening to cities across the globe. Rates of assault, armed robbery, and brutal homicides began climbing at a rate never before recorded in peacetime history. Major metropolises like New York, London, and Detroit transformed into dangerous, high-crime landscapes where citizens lived in constant terror. Criminologists threw their hands up in absolute despair, publishing countless papers blaming cultural decay, rock music, and economic shifts. But nobody noticed the mathematical phantom in the data. The graph of rising crime perfectly mirrored the graph of leaded gas sales from 20 years prior. The consumption of leaded fuel peaked in the early 1970s, pumping historic amounts of the neurotoxin directly into the atmosphere. Exactly 20 years later, in the early 1990s, violent crime rates hit their absolute, all-time historic high across the entire Western world. It was a flawless, devastating correlation that held true across different countries, distinct legal systems, and varied socio-economic classes. The third act of escalation brings us to the sudden turn of events, where a random environmental policy triggered an accidental psychological miracle. During the 1970s, pioneering environmental scientists finally gathered undeniable proof of lead's horrific impact on public health. Despite fierce, aggressive pushback from multi-billion-dollar oil corporations, governments around the world finally began forcing a phase-out of leaded gasoline. By the late 1980s, unleaded fuel became the mandatory standard, and the amount of lead in human bloodstreams plummeted by over 80%. What happened next completely shocked the entire scientific community and utterly shattered every single traditional theory of criminology. Instead of continuing to rise into total societal collapse as experts predicted, violent crimes suddenly began falling off a massive, unprecedented cliff. Year after year throughout the 1990s and 2000s, the murder rates plummeted, dropping by 50 to 70% worldwide. Politicians proudly took credit for new policing strategies, and economists pointed to financial booms, but the localized data proved them wrong. The massive drop in crime occurred uniformly everywhere, even in cities that had completely downsized their police forces or suffered economic recessions. The ultimate common denominator was beautifully simple: the first generation of children raised on clean, lead-free air had finally reached adulthood. Their prefrontal cortexes were healthy, completely intact, and fully capable of regulating impulses, resolving conflicts, and resisting the urge toward violence. We now arrive at the dramatic, haunting conclusion of this global experiment, where we must calculate the true legacy of our progress. This profound scientific phenomenon is known today as the lead crime hypothesis, and it remains a chilling reality of modern history. It stands as definitive proof that the delicate line between a peaceful civilization and chaotic barbarism can hinge on a single chemical compound. Thomas Midgley Jr. went down in history as the single organism who had the most disastrous, destructive impact on the Earth's atmosphere. In his frantic effort to fix a minor mechanical rattle in car engines, he accidentally poisoned the collective psychological architecture of humanity. Millions of human lives were cut tragically short by violence, millions more spent decades in prison, and entire generations lived in fear. While the physical lead has mostly washed out of our soil and air, the psychological scars on human history will endure forever. This historical nightmare serves as a stark, urgent warning about the hidden technologies and artificial chemicals we eagerly embrace today. We must look around our modern world and ask what current innovations are quietly, invisibly rewiring our brains right now. Are we currently setting the stage for the next massive, unexpected psychological ripple effect 20 years down the line? Because if history has taught us anything, it is that the true cost of our genius is rarely paid by the inventors themselves. It is paid quietly, over decades, by an unsuspecting world that forgot to look closely at the invisible air it was breathing.